such a rush. We have to warn the others. Good luck.
Okay, we're back again, and this time we're talking about a games company, so welcome to Let Me Fix Your Fucking Games. Now, I hate the Telltale games, and to many of you this isn't news, as I tend to say this whenever I get the opportunity, or when one of their games pops into my head, which recently hasn't been very often. However, with Telltale announcing that they're done, and apparently only going to do the last Walking Dead game, let's look at where they went wrong, and maybe what could have been done to make their games better. I'm going to try and not sound happy, but no promises. Telltale's The Walking Dead was my first real introduction to Telltale games. I remember seeing maybe Jurassic Park and Back to the Future, but I didn't have any interest in it, I didn't look into it. I enjoyed The Walking Dead, mostly. There were glaring problems even then, when I wasn't numb to the rinse, repeat, copy-paste nature that is Telltale games. The illusion of choice, well, I don't mind if a game has a few choices that really don't matter, as long as the game has an engaging story, good gameplay, nice aesthetics, and so on. Telltale games often has none of these for me. The only continuing appeal the games seem to have is the names behind it, the IPs, the intellectual properties. The Walking Dead, Borderlands, Game of Thrones, Minecraft, Batman, Guardians of the Galaxies, and apparently even Stranger Things was announced. This reeks of a company that uses the name recognition to sell games. So, what's the problem there? Well, after the original success of The Walking Dead Season 1 game, the devs apparently realized that while adventure games were dying, interest in them was waning, you could gain a lot of attention and press by gaining already popular IPs and making the same game over and over again with a different skin, taking heavily from the original IP in terms of story and direction. In fact, we don't really need to talk about The Walking Dead first and work our way through them. We can actually talk about the games in general, and the criticisms and improvements suggested can mostly blanket apply to all of them. In terms of gameplay, there is none. It isn't engaging. Combat is quick time, press a button. Chimps can do that, and it's about as fun as pressing a button when you're told. It should have never been there in the first place, and the insistence in keeping it baffles me to this day. Not to mention that it's presented as a set piece. You know, hit X now instead of hit Y, you know, press left, press right. There's no engagement. It's the same as the story. You're told what to do. You're told what to say. How about this instead? Mini-games, challenges, puzzles. When you're in a fist fight, why not allow the player to engage, to dodge, weave, punch, use dirty moves, or decide when they've had enough and surrender, instead of presenting the combat as a story where you've already decided what's going to happen. Instead, present the fight as something that could be up to the player, whether they want to choose to lose or to fight for ages but not win. All of these things could be interesting. Now, if there's a fight between a group and another group, turn it into a turn-based strategy or a real-time strategy, XCOM, maybe chess, anything along these lines. And I know why they didn't do it, and they did the quick time. It's because it's difficult, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Much better to make the same easy shit again and again, relying on the name to sell your game. Well, that's the gameplay shat on. Now for the most important thing in these games, story. And the story is kind of crappy. kind of. The Walking Dead is just The Walking Dead, and Fear the Walking Dead, because Fear the Walking Dead is just The Walking Dead. People find themselves in the zombie apocalypse, they try to survive, mostly fail, lots of poignant death scenes that get more and more boring as time goes on. It's true that people can get drawn into the games, and I really did like The Wolf Among Us. It engaged me more, I got drawn in more, and I could ignore the glaring problems with the game more. But the problem is that flimsy rope of story does eventually snap, and you find yourself with nothing left to hold you up, leaving you to realize suddenly that there really isn't any substance to the games. And Game of Thrones was even worse. Just like Walking Dead, people die a lot. I actually went into the game not giving a shit about anyone, and even worse than The Walking Dead, there was even more cameos from characters from the TV show, which just felt like fan service. I decided to bow to my enemy when I was playing Game of Thrones as the Young Lord, in the hopes of keeping him alive. I did everything. I made sure he was happy, and I was desperately trying to keep the Young Lord alive, only to find out that there was no way to do it. After going back multiple times and trying my best, I figured there'd be some way, but there just wasn't. And considering that you're supposed to have choices in these games, I often came out of Telltale games feeling like I'd just been on a train ride, where everyone got brutally murdered for dramatic effect, and every time I tried to do something about it, someone held me in place and whispered in my ear creepily, "Just let it happen." Now, this can be fine for a story in a game, but, well, not for one which starts every chapter with, "This game series adapts to the choices you make. The story is tailored by how you play." Really? Because I can save two different characters in two different playthroughs. They have little to no difference between them, and then they both die in the same spot, killed by the same person in the same way. Way to tailor things by how I play, seeing as these events are unavoidable. So how do we fix this? Well, as I said, I did enjoy The Wolf Among Us. It was the only game that felt like some effort had gone into it. The characters felt a bit more fleshed out than this dude. He's the angry one, and his anger makes him a loose cannon that backfires on him. Yeah, I'm talking about Kenny there. I do like Kenny, but I'm talking about Kenny there. Or, this guy is really nice, so it will feel worse when he dies, which is literally, well, I mean, pick a character. Perhaps if they had released even one original game with an original story, putting effort into characters and setting, fleshing out the world, instead of just taking whatever was popular, then maybe I would be more engaged. Maybe fatigue for Telltale games wouldn't have set in by The Walking Dead Season 2. So on to another problem area. It's an adventure game. And look, I'm not saying adventure games suck. They've just been drifting off for a while now. And honestly, the only thing that propelled Telltale games back into the limelight was the IPs it used. If they had done Telltale games Danger Mouse, well, I doubt people would have given a shit. Using famous IPs is definitely an option, and honestly, it's a viable one. But I think they should have used it to promote their own IP, their own story, their own worlds. And also, maybe they could have used it to innovate and push the boundaries of adventure games. I understand why games with choices often feel so different from what they should be. I mean, if you save one person rather than another, you end up with branching storylines where different characters are in different scenes. And this means the more branching paths, the more choices, and just the more freedom you give your players, then the more work you end up having to do. And this can definitely be a lot of work, but I think there are ways around it. If you don't want to have too many branching paths, too many different stories to tell, then hybridize the games. Instead of just keeping it point and click and conversation options and a few choices that ultimately feel like you have no impact, perhaps incorporate aspects of simulation, strategy, and RPG into the game. If you make a choice, have it affect characters, with characters learning different skills depending on your choices. Perhaps in a zombie apocalypse game like The Walking Dead, you could see the paths the other characters could take, assist in building them up and molding them into survivors. Developing characters as you play to have skills like fishing, scavenging, or first aid, and depending on what you choose and how you interact with them, it would have varying results. Not only would this make the choice of who to save or let die matter, but also it would make it feel like sitting there watching a subpar story progress a little bit less annoying, and takes away the sting of feeling like you're really getting in the way of the story. And if you could just sit over there, that's a good fellow, and now be quiet while Uncle Telltale tells you a tale. As a side note on these thoughts, I've often compared Telltale games to a shitty GM in a tabletop role-playing game. You know the ones I'm talking about, the ones who railroad you, tell you what to do and how, they don't adjust their story to the choices that you make, you're on rails and that's where you're gonna go. And you end up feeling like they should have just written a book, and honestly, that you didn't even need to be there. Ultimately, I felt like this with most of the games. It wasn't engaging, nothing I did mattered, and my skills or input had little to no effect on the game. So we've talked about the gameplay, we've talked about the story. Usually with games like this, there's often a few other things to talk about. With Telltale games, there isn't really that much. The only other thing that we can get into is the graphics, the art, the style, and honestly, it's just bad. I don't even really want to go into it that much because I don't feel like it's worth talking about. If the story was better, if the gameplay was better, the bad art style really wouldn't matter. As it is, very often we're confronted with horrific bugs, just terrible look and feel, shadows bloody everywhere, and it's just ugh. So considering we're not going to talk about art or style, that kind of thing, finally we're going to get to the final thing that I feel we need to talk about that needs to be fixed, which is us, gamers, consumers. As with everything, I'm sure the research and also the post-sales compared to popularity and so forth showed that while Telltale games were popular, sales didn't necessarily reflect that. And honestly, that's on us. It's easy to watch a game like this on YouTube or Twitch and then not buy the game. I can even understand it, but if we want good games, we have to support and buy good games. I think part of the refusal to innovate and work properly on their games comes back to the lackluster financial support they received. Ultimately, this mix of laziness and reluctance to improve from Telltale was what lost me. After their first few games, I mostly stopped playing, and aside from reading a few of the summaries of stories of later games, I stopped paying attention to them as they were stale and content thin. The truth is, we all share the blame for the demise of Telltale. We dug the grave at the start, and they nailed the coffin and laid it to rest. Ultimately, if we want to play good games from hardworking developers, we have to buy games we enjoy, not just watch them on YouTube or on Twitch and say how good it is. If hard work and innovative, interesting games are consumed, but not financially supported, then all we will get moving on is boring, lazy games made by cynical and money-grubbing developers, and we will deserve it. So, I'm going to leave you with this thought. Personally, I don't mourn the fall of Telltale games. I didn't enjoy their games, but looking back, it does feel like if a different choice was made earlier on, perhaps things could have been very different. Maybe our choices do matter. Had to.